Well, welcome to Growing Green, investing in conservation and local food. My name is Krista McGaugh. I'm the executive director of Tecumseh Land Trust. We operate out of Yellow Springs, Ohio, and serve primarily Greene and Clark counties. We are a land trust that is now 30 years old, 31 years old soon. And we have protected about 31,000 acres in Greene and Clark County primarily. We work with local farmers of many varieties to try to help them with preserving their farmland, also preserving their natural areas that lie within farmland. And we do that with them on a voluntary basis. We have conservation easements on those 31,000 plus acres that we will hold into perpetuity. So we are trying to conserve the irreplaceable soil and water resources that we have in Ohio that become even more important in the lens of climate change. Last week we had our initial event in this 4-week series, plus one. We're going to have a Earth Day tour of Agraria that I think will have at least partly virtual as well as partly live. This is a feature of a grant that Tecumseh Land Trust got about 3 years ago called the Jacobsi Partnership. A close partner, one of about 13 that worked with us to put this project together and continue to work with us to implement it is Arthur Morgan Institute for Community Solutions. Susan Jennings is its executive director, and she's here with us today. Community Solutions had purchased a farm in the Jacobsi Creek watershed in 2017. And the whole event created much enthusiasm about trying to look at a much deeper level of conservation in our area that would be really regenerating for soil, for water, but also for our local economy. We were really happy to be involved with the auction. The Village of Yellow Springs was as well. A lot of private citizens were as well. That allowed Community Solutions to buy their farm and educational center on regeneration called Agraria. And they have partnered with us on many things in this project, but in particular on these Growing Green conferences every year that are designed to kind of bring landowners in, especially in the target area, but in the wider area as well, together with leading agricultural economists, agricultural innovators from Ohio in particular. And these have been just very exciting conferences. We, this year, are in our multi-section virtual format, revisiting a lot of the topics that we had in mind last year, which have only become more relevant. As climate change proceeds, we also had the experience with COVID and some real brushes with food insecurity on the part of a much wider group of people than face food insecurity day in and day out. And that awareness is very important. The awareness of the fragility of our economy for most people is very important as well, and something that we need to work hard not to forget. We look forward to beating this virus, but we need to figure out how to build on that awareness on multiple levels, and we're looking forward to doing that in conjunction with our multiple partners on this project and beyond. We have got some old friends, some people that are really new to me that are providing great examples of agricultural innovation that are with us for today's presentations. And John Ikerd, who at least was a new friend when we started talking to him last year, but has been a real inspiration, again, with the COVID period being even more impactful in his work looking at food economy as well as how to address the conservation issues that are so important in agriculture and to us all. I am going to leave it at this point and introduce my colleague, Susan Jennings of our Third Morgan Institute for Community Solutions. Thanks so much, Susan.
Thank you, Krista. It's really great to be here. I'm really thrilled to see the many locals who were part of this conversation, because we, as Krista mentioned, we have a real interest in forwarding not just sort of the national conversation, but especially the regional and local conversation about the importance of food as an economic driver. So really thrilled to have everyone here. I did want to acknowledge a few people before I introduce on. Lauren Jessing from Tecumseh Land Trust has been an important part of putting this conference together, as have Rachel Isaacson and Alex Klug from Community Solutions. So thanks to all of them. And then I also wanted to acknowledge Bonnie Wilkinson, who's actually the person who suggested we invite John last year. So glad that you're on the call, John, or Bonnie, and that you have an opportunity to be part of this. So just most folks know about Community Solutions, but just 2 sentences that we are actually 80 years old, our organization. But as Krista mentioned, we bought Agraria just 4 years ago. Our 4-year anniversary is in a couple weeks. So we're looking forward to celebrating that with Tecumseh Land Trust and many other folks. So now it's really my great pleasure and honor to introduce John Ikerd, who is joining us this morning. John is such an amazing person to be reflecting on the time that we're in. He has many decades of experience, both on the ground and academically, and as an advisor and speaker and author. He's really thought more deeply, I think, about agriculture and its place in economics writ large, and American economics and Midwest economics than really anybody that I know. So we're so thrilled to have him. If you get inspired by his talk today, you might check out his website, which has a lot of resources on it. And we also did an interview with John that's on Community Solutions YouTube last year, when he was not able to come because of the shutdowns. We did an interview with John. So that was kind of at the beginning of everything, and now we're a year in. So looking forward to hearing his presentation. So a bit about John. He was raised on a small dairy farm in Southwest Missouri. He attended the University of Missouri, where he received a BS, an MS, and a PhD in agricultural economics. And he also served then as an extension agent with North Carolina University and Oklahoma State University. In the 80s, there are some of you here who remember the farm crisis. During that time, John had kind of a conversion, and this is one of the reasons I'm interested in hearing him speak today, because he has been and sort of at the center of many of the major changes in agriculture over the last several decades. So in the 80s, he recognized during the farm crisis that a lot of the policies he was advocating were actually detrimental to farmers. So he started to study what might be a different way of thinking about agriculture and economics. And so at that time, he returned to the University of Missouri and began to research sustainable agriculture. He authored book chapters, journal articles, magazine publications, and really investigated all parts of the sustainable ag movement, including profitability, policy, socioeconomic considerations, and more, and giving congressional testimony in '89 and '92 about his work. He retired from the University of Missouri in 2000. He was a professor there, and he began to write about agriculture and economics. And we probably won't have time today to really delve into his economic thinking, but it's just as transformative to me as his agricultural ideas are. His most recent book, I think, is The Revolution of the Middle and the Pursuit of Happiness, which he published in 2011. And also in 2011, he moved to Iowa, where he lives now. And there he's been teaching sustainable economics courses and putting on conferences and just contributing to the general conversation around sustainable agriculture. In 2014, he was asked by the Food and Ag Organization of the United Nations to develop the North American report for the International Year of the Family Farm. I'm quoting now from his bio on his website. In his report, he makes the case for multifunctional farm, which is what we're talking about today, and that protect and renew natural ecosystems and create and nurture caring communities as they provide economic livelihoods for farm families. And what a great vision of the future that is, John. And I'm really looking forward to having you talk to us about how we might work together to achieve that in our area.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that very generous introduction. It wasn't deserved, but it's always appreciated to be flattered a little bit, I guess. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you. I know it'd be better for all of us if we could be together in person, and maybe before too long we will be able to be together in person again. But for right now, we'll just have to deal with we'll have to deal with what we have, and we'll do the best that we can. I'm not used to, being on the screen and using PowerPoints and things of this nature, but I've kind of had to become used to it because I think people kind of get tired of just staring at a talking head for very long these days. So I'm going to go ahead and start my presentation. I'm going to share my screen where I have some visuals, but I'm going to go through it very quickly because I want to leave time for some questions and comments from other people afterwards. I tell people that what I say is what I call my truth. It's what I believe to be true based on my life experience. But if your truth's different than that, if you've come to different conclusions, well, that's all right with me. So I want to be able to hear your truth as well. So let's go ahead and start with the presentation. I've shortened it a bit from the title so that we could get it on the screen okay. And I'm going to go to screen share and try to go through it. I call it the future of food and farming. And that's what I really want to talk about. I want to talk about new opportunities that I think are arising now, or at least becoming apparent now, that weren't there before. But the big thing I want to get across today is that people have a tendency to just look at current situations as if they're sort of blips and long run trends, and that the trends that we've been in, for example, in agriculture and food systems for the last 50 years, that those trends are just destined to continue indefinitely. But the fact of the matter is no trend continues indefinitely. There's no way of knowing just exactly how long it's going to go on, but they don't go on indefinitely. So the question is now, when we look at the changes that are happening in the food system, particularly over the last year with the increased emphasis on local foods, and on top of that, the trend toward organic food and so on that's been going on in the regenerative agriculture movement. The question is, are these just blips in the long run trend to continued industrialization of the food system? Or are they harbingers of real change within the food systems overall? Back in the 90s, I came across an article in the Journal of Science, which is one of the most respected journals, international journals in the world. And it was a couple of, I think it was high school or college teachers, and what they proposed is what they call 20 great ideas of science. Now, what they were proposing here, they say that there's certain concepts of science that are so important that everybody needs to understand them. They should be taught grade school, high school, all the way through, so that people understand how the world works. And among those laws were such laws as the laws of gravity and motion and thermodynamics, which are familiar, particularly to high school and college students and so on. But there was one on that list of 20 that I didn't really expect and hadn't really thought about. It is the idea that everything on Earth operates in cycles. Now, there was some discussion in the international scientific community about that article, and they come back and they critiqued it a little bit, but everything tends to operate in cycles. The cycles may not be precise, they may not be predictable, but everything tends to operate in cycles, whether we're talking about the lunar cycles or the planet cycles or the seasonal cycles or business cycles or cycles in styles or a whole range of things. Everything tends to operate in cycles. And that's where the saying comes from, that everything goes up, eventually comes down. Everything that goes around eventually comes back around. That's just a reflection of that basic law. So I think we need to keep in mind that no trend continues forever. The basic question is, when will it change and how will it change? I contend that the current trends in the food and farming systems have basically run their course. And that when we look to the future of food and farming, it's going to be more like the food and farming systems of the past than it is of what we see today. I've lived long enough to see tremendous changes in the food system, tremendous changes in agriculture, and many of those happened in a period of about 40 to 50 years. And I think we could see those kind of changes in the future. Now, I'm not talking about going back to the farms and food systems of when I was a kid growing up on the farm, and we were still farming with horses whenever I was young, and there weren't any supermarkets, there weren't any franchise restaurants. It was kind of a local food system at that time. I'm not talking about going back to that. I'm talking about going back to the principles that are timeless. There are certain underlying principles about how the world works, where we fit, and how we relate to each other, that those are timeless. And if we look at the fundamental characteristics of the food systems and farms of the past, they were basically organic in the sense that they relied on nature. We didn't have the chemical fertilizers and the inputs and our pesticides and the big machines and things of that nature. They firstly depend upon nature for the productivity, and they were local. I would say when I was growing up, probably 70, 80% of the food we ate came within 50 miles of the farm. We had local processing plants, local packing plants for cattle and livestock, local flour mills, things of this nature, within 30, 40-mile radius of where I grew up, and we grew a lot of it on the farm. If we look at the fundamental characteristics, kind of those underlying principles of the farms and food systems that we have today, it's basically this industrial global model of farming and food production and distribution. It's highly specialized systems rather than diversified. It's routinized, mechanized. And then when you specialize, routinize, mechanize, you simplify the management process, and it allows you to consolidate control into larger and larger operations, and now corporate control of the food system. If you look at the organic and local food movement that I talked about earlier, is it a blip or is it a change in trend? It would signal a trend back to the future. It's diverse. The farming systems are diverse. The food systems are diverse. They're individualistic rather than routinized or standardized. Every farmer is different. It's interdependent. It's people that operate independently, but they choose to cooperate rather than being consolidated and controlled centrally. We look at the trends toward the future. The modern organic food movement that we have today, as I call it, the modern one, it began, really back in the early 1900s, but the sort of the modern phase of it began in the 60s, and that started with a back to the earth people, but basically it was a rejection of the industrialization of agriculture. The focus was on getting away from the pesticides and the chemicals and that sort of thing, but it was really about a rejection of the kind of the industrial way of life. They created their own communes and developed their own local food systems. Now, during the 90s and early 2000s, we saw the organic food then kind of break into the mainstream, and we had organic food sales were growing at a rate of about 20% per year throughout the 90s and up to 2008, which I refer to as kind of the Great Recession. And then there was some fall back, but they've still been growing at about 10% per year. During the 90s, we saw something I refer to as the industrialization of organic. As it became profitable for organic production to move into the supermarkets, then we began to see trends to try to specialize organic production rather than being produced on the small diversified farms. Then we saw large organic farms that maybe they have 2 or 3 crops, but were much more specialized. And then we began the organic USDA organic standards allowed to standardize and sort of routinize the production process. But it continued to grow, and that contributed to the growth. And today about 5% of the total food supply is in organic, maybe closer to 6% by now. Then we saw the reemergence of the local food movement, but that came about because of the industrialization of organic. There was the people in the early organic movement that it wasn't just about the pesticides and chemicals, which is basically what's in the USDA standards. It's a list of allowable and non-allowable inputs basically in the process, which has allowed them to industrialize it. But we saw the emergence of the local food movement for people that were earlier in the organic food movement or new people that were joining the movement. They wanted food that wasn't just about, the pesticides and fertilizers, but it had social and ecological integrity. And so they looked to local farmers, people that they could trust to produce food that had ecological, social, and they provided the economic integrity for the farmers that they believed in and trusted. And then I get to the COVID-19 pandemic that we saw beginning about this time last year. When that happened, then we had this industrial food system basically broke down, which I'll talk more about later on. But that industrial food system basically runs like an assembly line. Everything from the selection of genetics and the breeding stock and the seeds and so on that go into the system and then go through the production process and the processing and distribution is all lined up and to a great extent corporately controlled through that whole system. And it's a large, specialized mass production, mass distribution system. And when the COVID pandemic come along, the big processing plants, they were prepared to deal with increased absences during a time of illness and that sort of thing, but they weren't prepared for something so contagious that the whole plant would have to close down in order to protect the workers. And when those plants closed down, it disrupted the whole industrial food system. And so then we saw people at the local level that couldn't find food in the supermarkets and the restaurants were closed and so on. They turned to the farmers markets and the CSAs, and the farmers markets had to go virtual, and the CSAs, and many of them transitioned online. And the farmers markets and CSAs, any individual farmer that had an online presence, just all of a sudden saw more demand for their product than they could possibly supply. And then we saw an upsurge in what I call electronic aggregation through food hubs, where people were trying to get more food locally because they couldn't get it through the grocery stores. And then the food hubs would begin to get food from farmers or products from farmers that were not members of the food hub before, just trying to expand production as fast as they could. The COVID crisis revealed some of the major risks that are involved in our food system today. These industrial food systems they're very efficient, but they're lacking in resilience. In the quest for efficiency, they take out all of the redundance, all of the slack. It's all just-in-time production, just-in-time delivery, but it takes the resilience out of the system and makes them very vulnerable to disruption in class when you have anything that disrupts that assembly line process. It's like disrupting one phase on the assembly line. Large specialized farming operations also are inherently risky operations. They face production risk on crops from droughts or floods, insects, disease. We've experienced all of those kind of things over the last few years, particularly here in the Midwest when we had the derecho come through and we've had floods come through. And when you've got the whole farm in a crop or two crops like corn and soybeans, you can lose it all, the whole farming operation. And then these large confinement animal feeding operations in particular, in the feedlots out west for the cattle, you have weather risk, and you have crowding of animals together, you have risk of disease, public health concerns associated with these operations overall. So these are very efficient but very risky operations. Then you have market risk. You have variable production that can cause disruption in markets, disruption in exports, as we saw this year, declines in the general economy. Farmers this year, or farmers in 2020 are getting government subsidies, direct payments of something like $46 to $47 billion in emergency funds. It's because the whole system has been disrupted by the various things I'm talking about here. There's large financial risk because of the large financial capital that's required in debt financing. Basically, what's kept the industrial food system functioning and industrial agriculture functioning is the taxpayer basically has been asked to absorb the risk. Just like taxpayer absorbed the risk of the big banking operations that go under, kind of too big to fail, our food firms have become too big to fail. Some of our farms are too big to fail. So what happens is we have government programs and the taxpayers is asked to step in, just like it was during the COVID situation, and then bail out the system overall. The COVID revealed the risk, but it also reveals the opportunities that are inherent within that system. As I said before, consumers were seeking alternatives because of the pandemic had disrupted the industrial food system. We saw a tremendous increase in people wanting to put in home gardens. It was very difficult to get seed because people were buying seed to put in gardens. We saw a big increase in local food systems, of people trying to find more and more of their food local. And the non-industrial sector is where they really turned in a time when they're disrupted by the COVID system. We've been looking at alternatives to the industrial food system and been growing since the 1980s. We have a whole range of options that are out there today in terms of agriculture. We have the real organic movement, which has arisen in response to the industrialization of organics that I mentioned briefly a while ago. We have ecological farming. Acres USA talks about equal farming, ecological farming. Out in California, you have Equal Farming Conference, holistic resource management. Biodynamic farming is one of the earliest phases of organic. Natural farming, humanely raised animals, grass-based, free-range animals, sustainably produced, resilient, regenerative is the big thing I'll talk more about later now. But all of these are kind of movements away from the industrial model of agriculture and food production and more towards sort of the organic in the generic sense of relying on nature, the regenerative power of collecting the solar energy and allowing the plants and the animals and the crops all to work together as nature intended to produce food in a regenerative, sustainable way. They're non-industrial operations. They're diverse. They're not specialized. They're individualistic. Every farmer is different. They're not, and they're site-specific. You can't do the same thing everywhere. They're not standardized. They're interdependent. You have independent decision-making, deciding through choice to work together with each other. And these operations are not corporately controlled. They're controlled by the individual farmers and the local food systems that people in their community. They're management intensive. Rather than relying on capital and off-farm technology that's been developed by someone else, they rely on the knowledge and the intuition of the person that's managing the farm, the knowledge of how what's going on in the soil and the interaction between the plants and the animals and the interaction between people and in their community. And they tend to be smaller because it takes more management and to some extent more labor. Because it uses less capital and less purchased technology. And you generally produce more food value per acre than do the larger operations, but the farms tend to be smaller. Climate change has also been another factor in addition to the COVID crisis. Climate change was a big issue. It looked like it was going to be the political issue of the 2020s until the COVID crisis came along, but the climate change also is creating opportunities for these same farms and for the same kind of changes in food systems. So regenerative farming now is the kind of the key word. That's kind of the latest, most popular phase, but I contend it's the latest phase in the long run sustainable agriculture movement, which really emerged in this country in the late 1980s. When I become originally involved in it was in the late 1980s, when USDA started the Sustainable Agriculture, Low Input Sustainable Agriculture Program. It was originally kind of come out of the organic movement, come together with rural advocacy people and people that were concerned about the farm financial crisis and the cost of inputs. And that's where the low input part of sustainable agriculture came from, was reduction the reliance on off-farm chemical commercial inputs. Rural advocacy people were concerned about the negative impact of what happened in the 1980s with the collapse in industrial agriculture during that period of time. What happened with the impact on people that lived in rural communities, not only the economy, but the culture of rural communities. And then, as I said before, during the 1990s, we saw organic, the 2000s, then the local 2000s, and now 2010s. And now I think climate is taking us toward regenerative as we move through from sustainable to low input to organic to regenerative agriculture now. If we look at the definitions of regenerative agriculture, there's a lot of them out there, as there was for sustainability and the various other ones. But if you look at the USDA definitions in generally in the US, it tends to be defined in terms of specific farming practices. And the ones that are generally included would include reduced tillage, includes conservation tillage, no-till, minimum till, things of this nature. I spoke back in January at the National No-Till Conference, and they were talking on that conference about regenerative agriculture, that they're interested in that. But tillage is a part of it, reduction of fertilizers, pesticides, again, sort of reflection of the current organic movement, but also talking about the use of cover crops and crop rotations and livestock manure for fertilization. Talk about increased biological diversity, multi-species rotations, cover crops, and so on. And then well-managed livestock operations. I think there's a general consensus among those that take regenerative agriculture seriously that livestock always have a role to play. And the early organic farmers always talked about livestock being a part of recycling these nutrients, taking the solar energy going through plants and into the soil and the plants, and then run through the animals and so on back to refertilize the field. And fewer CAFOs, moving away from the large-scale confinement animal operations. And so the regenerative agriculture opportunities also include, I think, even more so, that's more consistent with the long-run movement of sustainability and the long-run movement to regenerative, resilient, resourceful kind of agriculture, and all of those balance. And this comes from Terra Generis with International, and they talk about a regenerative agriculture. It's in the broader sense. It's more like not just practices, but whole farm systems. It talks about increased biological diversity and the enrichment of soils, improving watershed, enhancing ecosystem services in the broad kind of systems approach. But also it ties it in with kind of the economic and the productivity side of it, increasing resilience, climate instability, dealing with those issues through regenerative agriculture. And the last one I think is tremendously important here, higher health and vitality for farming and ranching communities. So it sees regenerative agriculture in this social, ecological, economic sense that underlies all of these broader concepts of farming to more sustainable system. Underlying all of these is kind of the concept of science of agroecology, which is a combination of ecology and agriculture. It's a science-based sort of approach to regenerative agriculture. The first principle of ecology is everything is interconnected with everything else. You can't separate a farming operation out into individual practices and talk about the practices. You have to deal with the system as a whole. Every time you change one thing on a farm, you basically influence everything on the farm. Anything you change on a farm is going to affect the community in which the farm is functioning and the economy in which the farm is a part of. It's all interconnected. Soil, plants, animals, farmers, families, communities, all interconnected within their local food systems. That's the underlying principle. Agroecology, food sovereignty is another concept which ties together at the local level and considers food a basic human right and the right of people within their community to control their food systems. That's why I see these trends are moving. And the COVID crisis just simply revealed some of this crisis, some of the opportunities and some of the problems in the industrial food system that we didn't see before. So if we kind of summarize the opportunity, I see opportunities to relocalization alternatives, where we increased use of farmers markets, but also going more to CSAs and everything basically going online. I think there's advantages to having an online option for farmers markets. It would allow you to continue to function in bad weather, start earlier in the spring, go later in the fall, things of this nature. CSAs, I think you need to have an online option as well as in person. So I think that's an important thing that's been coming out during the COVID crisis and where we are right now. Marketing, food hubs, go into institutional market. Food hubs is where you get a large number of farmers come together so that they can have a larger quantity of product and greater variety. Electronic aggregation, again, using the digital technologies to make it accessible so that farmers can go online and say, this is what I have available, collection at a point online. Consumers can go online and say, this is what's available from the local farmers today, and this is what I can get. It's aggregating it online. Sales of local foods by supermarkets, I think, has kind of threatened the growth of the farmers market, CSA, and that sort of thing. But I think the COVID crisis has kind of revealed the vulnerability of relying on the local supermarkets and the mainstream markets as part of the local food system. I think we'll see that trend basically reversed as we go into the future. It's kind of like the industrialization of organic is the industrialization of local once you go into that mainstream food system. I think the greatest potential for the future is on online marketing. I believe we're seeing a fundamental shift in retailing in this country that goes far beyond food and includes the whole system. That's the reason you see Amazon growing like it is and various other things. We're moving away from the in-person kind of shopping on everything to more and more of everything going online. Right after the COVID crisis hit, the grocery stores were having problems getting product and that sort of thing. But even the online grocery sales, the mainstream grocery sales that are going online doubled right after the COVID crisis hit. So people more and more are going online. I think this creates opportunities for creating local food systems because I believe there's a potential economic advantage when you go to online aggregation, distribution, online markets. There's an advantage to doing it all local. To having local farmers and distributing within the local community. I think you can be much more efficient than you can with these large organizations like HelloFresh and Blue Apron and things like that tried to go nationally in terms of distributing meals and distributing product on a national basis. If you keep it local, and then also if you keep it local, then you may be buying online, but you're buying from people that you see at the farmers market, or maybe people that you're a member of the CSA. You're buying from people from in your own community, and you're providing food for people in your own community. Customers and farmers that care about each other and they care about the food that they're eating, and it reconnects farmers and customers who care about the land, who care about taking care of the productivity of a particular place and the culture of that place, but the ecological culture of the place as well. So I see tremendous opportunities to move in a fundamentally different and more positive direction. And I'm going to just quickly go through a number of examples of the kind of things that I'm talking about. Some of you may know these, and I know that you have some people on the conference later on that are going to be talking about things that are very similar, maybe even be better examples. But here's some that I've known. This is the Good Nature's Family Farm out of Kansas City, Missouri. And I'll read these in case of screens that you might not be able to see them. It says, since 1995, Diane and Gary Endicott, and I've known Diane Endicott since way back in that time, have raised natural food and beef using sustainable practices that result in foods free of antibiotics, hormones, and pesticides. Within 2 years of starting the farm, the Endicotts realized the need to aggregate with other small farming operations, a good-natured family farm with a membership of 150 small farms was born. Good Natured Family Farm now distributes its products of its members' farms through Ball's Food Store, which is the largest regional chain within Kansas City. And they've had a long-term operation through Ball Foods. They actually started off supplying Ball Foods with the kind of the high quality or high-end beef product on a regular basis. Diane Endicott's one of the best organizers I've ever seen at bringing people together. You imagine getting 150 farmers together to do anything and to have their own label and things of this nature, but and to get them to schedule the production of their beef herd so that they're slaughtering so many animals every week so they can keep things in the stores. But I point this out because this is one of the challenges of making this work. But there's people out here that have been able to do it. And this is opportunities for a lot of farmers that have been created. Here's one that's even bigger. I haven't been here. My friend Lonnie Gamble has talked with the people over at Riverford Organic in Devon, England. Say a self-condensed veg nerd, talks his name's Hai Singwat, has over the last 30 years taken Riverford from a one man and one wheelbarrow delivery homegrown organic veg to friends to a national veg box scheme delivering around 50,000 customers a week. Anything we can grow or make ourselves comes from our group of organic growers and producers, a whole group of them. Working with them over the long term means that our food is completely traceable. They know where it comes from. We think that small scale organic family farms are the most sustainable way to produce food. All of our suppliers look after their soil, their livestock, the wildlife by farming respectively and in tune with nature. We only sell food that we think is truly outstanding, made by people we know and trust. See the values that are reflected in this system. They had started off with, they've got 2 or 3 relatively large farming operations, but then a whole bunch of, I don't know how many of the smaller operations. You can go on and check out the website, and they show the small farmers that they're working with, but they're aggregating for this, and it serves the whole UK or England in particular. I think it's just located maybe in England, not elsewhere. But if you're in a particular part of England, then you get product from farmers in your particular region, even though it's a network that covers the whole country. It's all localized. It's all local, where the food comes from local people, from local farmers. Here's someone that some of you may know. This is the Greg Gunther, or Gunther Farms over at LaGrange, Indiana. In 1998, Greg Gunther was selling live hogs for less than his grandfather did during the Great Depression. It was then that he entered the meat industry, all the while still raising high quality pasture raised pigs like his family had for generations before him. Here at Gunther Farms, we specialize in quality meat that is favored of some of the best chefs in the Midwest. They sell a lot of it, did sell a lot of it to Midwest chefs. All of our animals are raised on pasture without the use of antibiotics. We have an on-farm USDA expected processing plant where we harvest, process, and package all of our animals delivered to upscale restaurants and retailers. Now we can order our meats and have them shipped directly to our door. We'd be honored to be your farmer. So Greg has built his own processing plant on the farm, and one of the things I wanted to mention here, well, first of all, during the COVID crisis when the restaurants closed down, he had the flexibility, he had the resilience built into that operation. They quickly shifted online and began to sell more and more of the product directly to consumers, directly to their customers, because there was a tremendous increase in demand for locally produced product. And they were in a position where they were online and they could go ahead and transition, so that they had to slow down for a period of time, but then their sales bounced back. Also point out that Riverford Organic, as I talked about before, they had such an increase in sales in England that they had to cut off new customers over there. They were selling everything that they possibly could. But the other thing I've talked about with Greg is his processing facility could handle a lot more animals. And I've talked to him, and he says, you know, the key thing, and he offered processing, he processes poultry and pork. He offered processing to local poultry producers, but the problem was they couldn't coordinate and decide, you know, who was going to deliver poultry when. And he says, you know, if you're going to run a processing plant, you got to be able to depend upon having a certain number of birds at a certain time. Another example is White Oak Pastures. I'm kind of running short here in terms of, you know, leaving time for questions. This is even a bigger operation. White Oak Pasture, 6 generations, 150-year-old farm, 152-year-old family farm in Buffton, Georgia. If you slip on down through here, it takes 155 caring people working together to accomplish this. They have an on-farm processing and so on. But anyway, the people there, Will Harrison is involved in that. You know, he talks about the opportunities of getting local farmers together. So it's not just one big operation like his, and he's showing that it can work on a scale, and he sells into Whole Foods and a lot of other places. And I'll finish up here in terms of the examples with opportunities on grain farmers, and there are opportunities across this. And this is a long-time grain operation called Shepherd Grain. It was around in the 1980s when I first started in the sustainable agriculture movement. He's mixed timeless values and traditions with modern-day commitments to preserve our planet for generations to come. Sustain our family tradition is immediately connected to sustaining the earth, enable our livelihood. Co-founders Fred Fleming and Carl Cooper started Shepherd Grain in 2003 to promote no-till, direct-seeded farms so that they could renew and preserve the land for generations to come, theirs and yours. Each grower is certified Food Alliance for Sustainability that know that better soil makes richer grain, which produces frail and bakes better and tastes better. As Fred says, when you bake with Shepherd's Grain, you become a food activist and a disciple to save the family farm. The key point here is all of these are selling their products and promoting their products based on underlying values that go back to the concepts of true values and principles that underlie the food system historically. Just in summary, you know, trends never continue indefinitely. What happens is they go too far. And I think we've gone too far with the industrialization of agriculture, the industrialization of the food system. And when they go too far, they violate some fundamental principles of how the world works, how we fit within it, how we have to conform what we do to what nature will allow us to do here. And it eventually leads to their downfall and their reversal. Our current food system is not sustainable. I can't tell you how long we can continue to prop it up and how long it can go, but it can't go on indefinitely. Trends never return to the same world they left, but they return to the fundamental principles of nature, including human nature and social relationships. And those things never change. They're an inherent part of how the world works and how we work and who we are as human beings. The industrialization of agriculture has gone too far. It's violating ecological, social, and economic principles that are essential for positive human relationships. The agri-food system of the future will be fundamentally different from those today, and they will return to the timeless principles that have always been there. Change creates challenges, but it creates opportunity. Change is creating new opportunities for American farmers to transform the food system. So that's my truth. So we've got a couple of minutes here, about 5 minutes, I think, at least left for questions and comments. So let me stop sharing and we go back. So who has a question? If someone's feeling the questions, why, pass them on to me verbally. I'll take a look here and see what I've got.
John, we did have a question from someone named Florence who's interested in urban agriculture, and she's wondering, is there an economics and science developing around urban agriculture and rooftop farming? And she says she's a physician in Cincinnati and trying to improve the health of the community.
Yeah, there's a whole urban farming movement that's very vital. To serve those communities. So I'm sure that almost any city, if you're around Cincinnati, you can find someone that's involved in the urban agriculture movement. I encourage people to go online and do Google searches for urban agriculture Cincinnati, or wherever you are. But the urban agriculture movement's been going on for quite a long time. They used to have what was it called, the garden cities movement in the early 1900s was had a lot of the characteristics of what we're seeing now, where urban areas are not only producing more internally, and if you look at some real examples of cities like Detroit and what's the one, Newark, New Jersey, places where the center city has been hollowed out, then they've come in and they have gardens in the lots, and they have a major sort of urban agriculture movements going on there. But urban agriculture movements is going on everywhere. Community gardens, whole community garden movement. If you go out and look at community gardens, you can find community gardens probably in Cincinnati or Cleveland or anywhere in the area, and would give you a contact point where you could contact somebody that's involved in the community garden movement, and they would get you involved with the urban agriculture movement. In fact, I wrote a chapter in a horticulture book on the urban agriculture movement, so it's strong and healthy.
We had a local schools panel in 2020, and we learned about this effort called the Good Food Purchasing Policy that the Cincinnati school system's implementing. Right. And I know they're working on implementing that in the hospital system there. I wonder if you've heard of that, John, because I think it's a national effort.
Yes, there's farm to school programs going on. Again, you can Google that. USDA has a farm to school program, but a lot of them are going on their own, is trying to hook up local farmers with local schools. And that's where the food hub concept comes into a lot of times, because you'll probably need to aggregate production from several small farmers in order to meet the needs of a school or meet the needs of a hospital. And particularly if you're going to go beyond just providing a single item, if you're just providing apples or you're just providing potatoes or something like that, maybe one farmer can do it. But if you want to expand beyond and try to go to more of a local food menu, then you need to get a number of farmers together and then decide what to produce, because you're going to have to meet certain standards of quality when you're marketing into a school or when you're marketing into a hospital. And there's probably going to be certain standards of sanitation and things like that you're going to have to meet in order to meet those requirements. So it's just good if you can get an organization of people and somebody involved that is willing and knows how to go through the process of making the arrangements to make those transactions into the institutional markets.
Great, thanks. I think we have time for one more question. This question came from I'm not sure, but it says, what would be your suggestion for non-industrial agricultural nonprofits wanting to somehow promote, enhance, expand, or otherwise advance local control of our food system?
Well, I'm working. I don't know what kind of nonprofit it'd be, but I've been in communication with. I shouldn't say I'm working with. I'm kind of as a informal consulting with a group out in Denver, Colorado called Metro Caring. And I've been trying to promote the idea of use that I call community food utilities, using the concept of a public utility to kind of separate the local food system or whatever you want to do locally from the pressures of the international marketplace, which always comes in and tries to industrialize everything that's successful. And so I think this whole area of food security, of addressing hunger, is one where we could really focus the local food movement. If we can focus on making sure we have good food, accessible and affordable to people within the local community that have the fewest opportunities, the people that are going hungry, particularly the kids, if we can focus on that. And then the community food utility idea, what I was trying to do with that is leverage government food assistance funds that are already allocated and already recognized as a legitimate public service. Use those funds for people that want to become a member or become affiliated with the utility to ensure them that you're going to get good, nutritious food, food that's good to eat, and be mostly focused on raw, minimally processed food and help people learn to prepare it and this sort of thing. But I think if you're a nonprofit organization that's interested in those sorts of things, that if you can focus on some aspect of local food security, getting food into the schools where kids, get some of their meals, or focus on food security, then you can begin to gain public support to try to localize the source of the food that you get to people within the local community, and kind of have the nucleus then for creating a local food system around the concept of food security, because that's basically what sustainability is about. When I define sustainability, and I think a lot of people that take it seriously define it the same way, it's about meeting the needs of the present without diminishing opportunities for the future. We focused a lot on taking care of resources for the future and sustainability, but we have to meet the needs of the present. I would argue that there's no greater need to meet the needs of the present than to make sure that everybody, particularly our children, have all of the good, nutritious food that they need to lead healthy and active lifestyles and to grow into, productive people with a desirable quality of life. I talk about that as the first requisite for sustainability, is to provide food security now. How can we expect some mother, to be concerned about climate change in future generations when our kids are hungry? So, if we focus our concept of sustainability on meeting the needs of people on food security, and then build that into a local food system that has ecological, social, and economic integrity, then I think that's the direction that we need to move.
Well, John, thank you so much. I think right now we should go into a break, but John will be back on our next panel discussion starting at 11 o'clock this morning. So in about 7 minutes. So let's go ahead and take a break. And John, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you. All right, we'll see everyone back here in just a few minutes.